can begin whenever you're ready.
As we continue our discussion on match for the McKinney-Vento Homeless Act, particularly for the COC program activities, I would like to turn your attention from the prior discussion of fund accountability that is in 2 CFR 200 over to the enabling legislation and the regulations for the McKinney-Vento, which is found at 24 CFR 578. Again, the whole chapter for 578 governs the COC program. And particularly, we're going to talk about match, which is found at 578.73. However, this also will require you to review Subpart D, which is program components and eligible cost, as well as mentioned in the previous discussion, the record-keeping requirements, which are found at 578.103. Understanding match. This portion is by the slides as we go through them and explaining both what match is, what is not match, what counts as match, and how do we document match. To provide an understanding of match, match is either cash or in kind. And again, as you read through the regulations at 578.73, it'll give you all of the specific elements. It must cover all the eligible costs of the program, which is found under Subpart D, which is 578.37 through 63, the components and then the eligible uses. Costs incurred by a partner organization must be documented either for in kind or for cash by an MOU, and particularly prior to the grant agreement execution stage. And then lastly, as mentioned, program income can also be used as matched, and the regulations for program income is found at 578.97. And program income for fiscal year 15 and 16 grants does recognize program income as an eligible match source. What is not match? Not match is cash or in-kind contributions that is used as a match for another grant. And so you cannot double count any source, whether it's cash or in-kind, to meet the needs as a match for this program and for another federal program simultaneously. That match source, cash or in-kind, can only be used for a single grant. Moving on, cash or in-kind contributions that are statutorily prohibited as match are that is ineligible under the COC program. So again, point 73 identifies what are the eligible sources, which includes most other federal, state, or local, including private sources, can be used as a contribution to match your program. Please note, you cannot use COC funds to match a COC grant. Similarly, as mentioned, you cannot use ESG funds to match an ESG grant. Also, what does not match is in-kind services that are provided by a partner or a secondary or subrecipient entity that is not documented with a memorandum of understanding. Also, what is not matched is program participant savings. And I would expand this to say savings or other income. Specifically, savings or income that belongs to the program participant but does not belong to the recipient or subrecipient cannot be counted as match. The example provided in the prior webinar mentioned TANF funds, temporary assistance to needy families. Those dollars are typically awarded to an individual or a household as income to that household. Then those funds cannot be counted as match. Similarly, a individual that receives Medicaid or Medicare directly, those costs cannot be counted as match. What is match? Match requirements must be able, the recipient and subrecipient must be able to document all cost. As identified in the previous discussion for 2 CFR 200, according to cost accounting principles, the same principles that apply for the expenditure of your receipt of federal funds also applies for match. So you must be able to document that it's real, it's allowable, it's eligible, allocable cost. Match requirements. The CLC program requires that 25% of your grant from HUD must be matched. In our legacy programs under Shelter Plus Care and supportive housing programs required a different percentage of match. Both for the program and SPC, it was 100% or dollar for dollar. And in the SHP, it was 20 and 25% respectively for support services and operational cost. However, under CLC program, then the match is 25% of your grant directly from HUD. And particularly for all line items or budget line items except leasing. And we will show an example of that. Match is provided to the entire CLC grant, not specific to a budget line item. And we'll do an example of that as well. But to understand, you can match your entire grant in funding activities that are not part of your grant budget. So you are actually matching your whole grant and irrespective of your budget line items. Matching funds can only be used on eligible CLC program cost. Eligible CLC program cost is again subpart D as in dog or David under the regulations at 578, and they include the components of the CLC program and the eligible uses. Briefly, to summarize them, the components are planning, unified funding agency cost or UFA cost, acquisition, rehabilitation, and new construction. Those are components. Uses are leasing, rental assistance, supportive services, operating cost, HMIS, admin cost, relocation cost, and indirect cost. And those subsections of 578 is subsection 37 through subsection 63. As an example of matching, we'll give you two scenarios. The first scenario is an award of $49,500. the respective budget line items include supportive services, rental assistance, admin, which is by statute limited to 10%, but many of our COCs have limited to 7%. That and the respective budget line items and amounts would be a total of $49,500. In this scenario, which does not have any leasing costs but has rental assistance costs, the entire budget must be matched by 25%. As such, 25% of $49,500 equals $12,375. In our second example, it would be a project that has leasing cost, has supportive services, budget line item, and program admin. But in this example, the $20,000 that is allotted for leasing is subtracted from the grant total, and the match requirement of 25% is now based on $29,500, and as such is only $7,375. So as you calculate match, then be aware of whether your budget includes leasing, reduce your budget total of the leasing amount, and you match 25% for the remainder of the grant. Similarly, as we look at match and budget line items, as indicated, your match obligation is the full grant and not specific to budget line items. In this example here, you have operating support services and project admin. Budget total is $110,000. Your match liability is, in this example, $27,500, which is 25%. However, you can match the services activities, which are your uses, even though your grant award did not include direct expenditures for services. Similarly, your grant award included operation dollars, but you're not obligated to match the operations cost. So your liability of 25% is spent on the entire grant minus any leasing, but not to any specific budget line item. Now let's look at match documentation. All match must be documented, and it must be documented prior to the execution of the grant agreement. As a direct grantee from HUD, in processing your grant execution, you are required to upload match documentation in the eSNAPS system. eSNAPS is also used to have made your formal application. Your appropriate CPD rep that's assigned to your continuum or to your project in processing your grant agreement in eSNAPS will require you to submit, which is to upload, appropriate match documentation. Please note, for some grantees, they upload appropriate match documentation during their application stage, and it is recommended to do so. In doing so, during the CPD field office review of your submission, that match is then noted and execution is facilitated without additional issues and conditions. And so as you are completing your application, you can upload your match documentation in addition to indicating your match commitment in eSNAPS, and it will facilitate easier processing for grant execution once the awards are available. So documentation of the formal match must be evidenced prior to the grant agreement being executed. If the recipient needs to change his match source, the match agreement must be in place before the new source can be counted as match. And so the program does allow for a grantee to change from the application stage its commitments of match, which must be noted, at the execution stage. However, in order for that match to then be counted, which again must be evidenced prior to grant agreement, then the new match source must be documented. Moving forward, grant match documentation must demonstrate that match is spent on eligible activities and incurred within the grant period. And as we look at the requirements for the MOU and or for the cash documentation, and then the documentation must indicate that match will be spent on eligible activities and the time period that the match would be available, which must coincide with the effective period of that grant, which is the operating start date through to the expiration date of that grant. Lastly, and as indicated both in the prior webinar for fund accounting as well as in 578-103, which is the record keeping requirements, then the grantee is obligated to keep source documentation, including the MOU, on file for review when needed. And that is either at the time of monitoring or if they're subject to audit at a time of being audited. Cash match documentation. As indicated, cash match can be either in kind or in cash. And this goes over the cash match documentation. Cash match must be substantiated within the agency that receives our grant. As such, it must be committed on written documentation. The grantee must document the commitment of their resources for the cash match. The source is not respective to the grantee's documentation on their letterhead, such as if your matching source is coming from the Development Services Agency in the form of housing trust or crisis dollars, the requirement to document the match is irrespective of your source. It can be from state dollars, it can be from private dollars, it can be from fundraising dollars. The specific requirement is that on your letterhead as the grantee, signed, which is committed by an authorized representative and appropriately dated, is the minimum requirement for the documentation. Documentation must include the amount of the cash to be provided, the specific dates that the cash is made available, the actual grant. And again, for our field office, we always advise you to know and include your grant number on all documentation and all correspondence, as well as the fiscal year in which that cash will be contributed, and then include the allowable activities, which again is subpart D. In-kind. In-kind donations must also be substantiated with written documentation provided on a source agency's letterhead, signed and dated by an authorized representative. And so the grantee can provide its own in-kind donations to be counted as match. And that in-kind can be from their own personnel, it can be from their own equipment, it could be from items that they are going to be donating to the program, but whatever that donation is, again, must be substantiated and tracked with written documentation on letterhead, committed appropriately and dated. Documentation must include, again, the description and the value of those donated goods, the specific date, and the grant. Again, tying it to the grant, it must be an unconditional commitment to that particular grant. and the method that is used to determine the value of the donations. And again, 578.73 of the regulations identifies this methodology. Most often, in-kind services committed by a third party is committed for match. And oftentimes, it's in a greater amount than the 25% obligation. As mentioned under the previous, what we call legacy programs for shelter plus care, the match requirement was a dollar for dollar or 100% match. And in those instances, the MOU was signed between the housing provider and a support service provider in an equal amount of the grant. In these COC grants, the 25% is sufficient. However, if you commit above 25%, then you've created an obligation for yourself, and you must evidence that as you track your match activities. As indicated previously, match is not match provided by a third party if it is not evidenced by an executed MOU that's been entered into prior to the grant agreement execution itself. These MOUs, which are required to be uploaded in eSnaps as a part of your grant execution process, is required to be executed. The MOU has minimum conditions. As indicated here, the MOU must provide an unconditional commitment to provide the service. And again, this is by the third party committing to our grant recipient and specific to that program and the eligible activities. Eligible activities is anything that you would spend our CLC dollars on, is what you can count as match being provided by a third party. The MOU must also describe the specific service that is to be provided. And again, that has to be an eligible service under subpart D and eligible uses. It indicates the profession of persons that are providing the service and the hourly cost of that service. As indicated in the prior webinar, if there is a standard rate based on a standard provision of services, such as Medicaid reimbursement rate or ODMS reimbursement rate, or your local alcohol, drug, and mental health levy, and has usual and customary rates, then those rates are sufficient for match documentation if so indicated. Otherwise, you need to indicate the profession of the person that's providing the service and their hourly cost of service. The MOUs must identify the time period in which those services will be provided, which, as noted, would be simply the effective period of your individual grant, and the system that will be used to document the actual level and value of services as provided. These are the elements of match. What is match? What is not match? How is match counted? How is match calculated? And how do you document match? Match is a statutory obligation to your CLC grant. It must be spent in the same manner as your grant is spent, evidenced and documented in the same fashion as well, and with foul documentation subject to review. As you're aware, in addition to match, the program, and particularly the notice of funding availability on an annual basis, also counts leverage. Leverage, however, is neither statutory nor is it regulatory. So it is simply described here on this slide. It is counted as a part of your point system for your application, both on the CLC level as well as on your individual project level as obligated by your CLC. And that's for this audience, that's the balance of state. However, HUD does not monitor, nor does it audit, nor does it review leverage. So all of the previous discussion points is concerning match, but does not apply to leverage. So what is leverage? Leverage is separate and distinct from match. It can be cash or in-kind contributions in excess of the minimum required match. Hence the prior statements that if you have matching sources that is greater than your 25%, then you can actually count that as leverage instead of counting it as match, because committing it as match makes it an obligation to the grant, and it will be measured and monitored or audited against your statutory commitment. However, anything above 25% is better described as leverage. The leverage can be used on costs that's not allowable in the CLC program interim rule. The distinction is that to be counted as match, it must be used on other eligible activities that your actual grant can be used for. However, many programs and projects has costs that are beyond the eligible cost of the CLC program. As such, your leverage can be used on costs that's not allowable under the interim rule. And there's no limitation on that financial source being from any other public or private resource. And again, it does not include benefits that are received by or used directly by program participants. Thank you for your attention and your attendance for this webinar. Again, my name is Anthony Forte, and I can be contacted as follows on the screen with our email address. And on behalf of Ms. Garland, we thank you for your participation. You can forward any questions you may have to us, and we will answer them as appropriate. Goodbye.
All the slides up there changed all these slides from
I know.
CLC to COE.
I know that. I was like, I kept looking at it. I'm like, why is that looking like it's a capitalized C?
Yeah.
And I kept looking back to mine, and I'm looking
so
here,
strange.
and it was saying COE as if it was doing. What was it?
I think you
Must
said
be cash match.
I think you said cash match me cash or in kind.
Oh, okay. Well, if I misspoke, hopefully the rest of it clarified.
Yeah, I think it will. Well, you talked to one company.
Did I?